I have been sewing for, here is it, sewing mistakes. I've spent more than 30 years making them, some big, some small, all important lessons learned that I would now like to share with you, dear viewer. Let us take a tumble through some of the iconic pieces of my medieval and Renaissance wardrobe and see what exciting errors we may find. I have been attempting to turn fabric into some semblance of medieval and or Renaissance clothing since I was 14, which would mean almost 30 years at this point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when I started as a little girl, there was no internet really to speak of. But by the time I was actually seriously sewing, the internet was really just a vast wasteland of chat and porn and had no information really worth knowing or worth considering. And my local libraries were very small, and I didn't even understand that library loan was a thing, nor did I think to ask if it was a thing. So I didn't know that I could get more informative publications by having them sent to me. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that I have spent the last 30 years nearly destroying fabric in the quest for sartorial knowledge of a historical type, which means that in my wake, I have left a vast graveyard of fabric. And so, I would like to prevent you, dear viewer, from making the same mistakes I have over the years. Very honest mistakes, every single one of them extremely rich and informative. But why should you, dear viewer, make the same mistakes when you can learn from mine? So today we're going to be taking a sort of sartorial tour through the history of the Contessa from some of her earlier beginnings. And I will be showing you the major mistakes on each of these garments. So let's dive right in. This beautiful garment here, which, as you notice, it doesn't have sleeves currently. This was a Burgundian style gown in the style of Margaret of York that I designed and made for a coronation in the SCA. But this beautiful gown, silk satin, with about 90 hand appliqued, hand stenciled, hand cut out black silk dragons, this gown has a sad story. Namely, I patterned it and I was all by myself. I drafted the pattern myself. I created it, I tested it. I was so proud of it. But what I didn't think about is that I fit this pattern on my mostly bare body, not over top of a kirtle, not over top of a smock. And so my number one first tip to you, dear viewers, is any gown, any piece of clothing that you are making, if it is meant to be worn over something, anything, you must first have those under things, and you must be wearing those under things when you either create your pattern or when you actually fit your garment, because I didn't. Even though this gown fit me absolutely perfectly without anything under it, the second I put on my linen smock and of course the appropriate kirtle, it slid horribly off my shoulders. I mean very badly, because the arm's eye of my kirtle was not the same as the arm's eye here, and this was too tight with all the layers of kirtle and linen undergarment underneath of it. So, number one tip, dear viewer, whatever goes under the garment that you're making, you must first have and wear when fitting the garment that goes over it. And in fact, as you will see, I did this, unfortunately, I made this mistake on two of these garments, these gowns that I created at about the same time and didn't figure out my mistake until I cut them both out and sewn them both. So this one is in the process of being reconstructed to fit over top of kirtles. So unfortunately, what I'm going to have to do is completely rebuild the sleeve cap, because the sleeve cap needs a lot more room. And I did that on this one. As you can see, all the additional pieces I added by trial and error, by literally removing the sleeve, putting on the gown, pulling up the sleeve, and eyeballing where I needed to add pieces based on just where my arm rested and where the sleeve cap did not reach to. And so I've basically had to reconstruct not only the arm's eye, but I also needed to reconstruct the entire back. So I actually had to bring the back up significantly higher to prevent it from sliding off of my shoulders. And then I needed to reconstruct the collar, the turn back collar, to fit that new neckline. And that is the process wherein this gown finds itself. So I could have prevented all of that woe if I had just fit the pattern over top of a smock and a kirtle. If you have any questions about this garment and fitting it and the process, do let me know in the comments below. Cheeky self-promotion time. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube, or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Tip number 2. If you are lining a gown, you should hang the lining and the shell for at least a week. Hang them high enough so that they completely hang with no parts being supported by the floor or some other surface, so that gravity can stretch them as they will stretch when they are being worn on your body. If you do not do this, you will get uneven stretching over time, and your lining or your shell will not be the right length. And if your lining, which is most likely to stretch more, because your lining tends to be slightly less full or less heavy than your shell, then what you will end up with is a lining that bags, and that will actually hang lower than the shell, and then it will wear and tear away as it drags on the ground. And that's how you end up with a hemline that looks like this. So this beautiful gown I made many years ago, 2009. This was also part of my royal wardrobe, as it were. And I even remade it in 2015, and I thought I had let it hang long enough, but I will admit I was in a hurry to get it done in time for Known World Medieval and Renaissance Dance Symposium, and so I didn't really let it hang long enough. And so over time, the lining has stretched beyond the shell, and so it has worn away, and I will have to figure out some clever way to patch the bottom, because I don't think I have any more of this silk left, and put in some kind of protective facing, probably, as we see in Beata Osana's Gamora. Tip number 2, hang shell and lining for at least a week so that everything stretches before you actually clean up the hem at the bottom. Speaking of lining, let us talk about bag lining. Tip number 3, bag lining. Don't do it. If you're doing a medieval and or Renaissance garment, or really pretty much any kind of pre-modern garment, there aren't many or any examples of which I'm aware of extant garments or any evidence for bag lining. Bag lining means you sew 2 garments basically entirely, and then you attach one to the other at the neckline and the hemline and the cuffs of the sleeves or the armscye, depending on whether it has sleeves or not. And this creates a kind of baggy interior that will actually hang away from the shell, and it creates a garment that doesn't necessarily drape properly, but more problematically, especially if you don't follow tip number 2, which is hang your lining and hang your shell, then you end up with a lot of extra fabric, usually on the lining, that stretches down below the shell, and it is what drags. And on this Gamora, this cotta, really, that I made in 2001 with nary a clue about anything. That is what has happened to this hemline. As you can see, it's completely worn away because the lining stretched way beyond the shell. And of course, I dance and move everywhere. And so, you know, there's probably, I don't know, at least 2,000 or 3,000 miles danced and or walked in this gown across dirty, scrabbly, rough surfaces. The kind of surfaces that this gown maybe was never actually intended to encounter in its Florentine life, which would have been mostly lived on beautiful marble or wooden parquet floors, or maybe even just smooth stone surfaces on the way to the piazza, where dancing would have happened on a wooden platform covered in beautiful Turkey rugs. So it's an example of me perhaps using this gown in ways it was never meant anyway. That doesn't change the fact that bag lining has no real medieval or Renaissance examples, and that's probably because Bag lining means sewing two entirely separate dresses basically and then attaching them. That's double the work. And when you're sewing by hand, you don't want double the work. You just don't. Even if labor is so-called cheap, which is debatable in Florence, that doesn't mean that you necessarily want to pay extra when you don't have to, or you don't want to do extra work if you don't have to, if you are doing said work yourself. So what that means is the bag lining here has resulted in the lining completely wearing away. Not great. You know, it also means that this lining, and this is a part that people who don't move as much as I do in their historical garments maybe wouldn't have experienced, but I have. The bag lining becomes a literal vacuum bag of geologic amounts of detritus. Dust actually gets inside. It works its way through the weave of the fabric because of the action of being dragged across the ground and ends up inside here. And some of you have seen the pictures or videos of the post-event bathtubs where I've soaked dresses like this. And that's in part not because of what's here on the shell fabric, but because of what is in the interior layers of that garment itself. And then that can kind of work its way back towards your legs through motion. So you get this horrible ebb and tide of dirt through your bag lining. So bag lining, I just recommend avoiding it altogether if you are trying to create a historic garment. Why is bag lining done these days? That's a good question. I don't know. It probably has something to do with the factory approach to sewing. If you have any idea why we now bag line garments modernly, please do let me know in the comments below. I would be fascinated to know why. So tip number 3, no bag lining. Alternative methods are flat lining, in which you line each piece before sewing together and then sew all lining and shell together. Or there's other methods where you can actually tack and whip stitch each panel of your lining into the completed garment or the mostly completed garment. This makes it easy to remove linings, like fur, for instance. Or if individual panels wear away, that means you can remove just the one panel instead of having to unsew everything, right? So there's different lining methods that I can recommend, not bag lining. Well, those have been your tips from my years of sewing mistakes. I'm confident I will think of more for future videos. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of feline felicity.
Ooh.